Hi everyone, welcome back. This is part 2 of this video series. Part 1 lays the foundation for expanding the current diagnostic paradigm for NPD. You can find a link to that video in the description. Part 2 will focus on developing a more comprehensive and compassionate model for NPD that includes both grandiose and vulnerable dimensions of the disorder. The DSM and the NPI form a feedback loop, where the DSM provides the description and the NPI provides the data that supports new versions of the DSM. These constructs are referenced by authors and screenwriters to create fictional representations of narcissists as villains, and to prop up the narcissistic abuse market that produces titles like How to Kill a Narcissist. Have you ever heard any other legitimate mental health disorder talked about this way? Think about it for a second. What if depression or anxiety were treated the same way that narcissism is treated? Ironically, when it comes to narcissism, we all may be suffering from a lack of empathy. Okay, so the DSM is wrong, and the NPI is wrong, and popular media is wrong. Then who's right? And just what the heck is narcissism? The concept of narcissism dates all the way back to the early 20th century and a famous paper by Freud himself. But the latter half of the 20th century saw narcissism become an extremely important concept in psychology. And that's because narcissism is considered to be one of two poles around which personality develops. There's the relationship pole, how we relate to others, and there's the narcissism pole, how we relate to ourselves. In other words, self-image. There is such a thing as healthy or adaptive narcissism. That means that you've developed a healthy, stable, and realistic self-image. And there's such a thing as unhealthy or pathological narcissism, where the self-image is damaged or distorted. It can be distorted in a positive direction, which causes grandiosity, or, and here's the clincher, in a negative direction. That gives you unrealistically negative self-images that are unstable and in constant danger of collapse. This is called vulnerable narcissism, and it is just starting to get recognized, but I would argue that it is 10 times more common than grandiose narcissism. These are the narcissists that therapists see in their practices, only they don't recognize them as narcissists. They call them depressed or anxious or bipolar. Now, I'm not saying that every depressed person is a narcissist. Far from it. What I'm saying is that underlying personality dysfunction produces symptoms. For vulnerable narcissists, those symptoms are often mistaken for more familiar forms of mental illness, like depression. Essentially, when a person spends exorbitant amounts of time and energy attempting to maintain a positive self-image, and they go about doing so in inflexible and maladaptive ways, we call that pathological narcissism. And contemporary research looks at the interplay between two factors, narcissistic grandiosity and narcissistic vulnerability. These terms simply describe the manner in which a person is going about attempting to manage their self-esteem. The vulnerable face of narcissism is what has been missing from our diagnostic picture and our national discussion about this disorder. Vulnerable narcissism involves the conscious experience of helplessness, emptiness, low self-esteem, and shame. In other words, this guy. Narcissus of ancient Greek mythology is the original narcissist. The disorder is named after him. He's often portrayed as gazing adoringly at his own reflection, and people mistakenly believe that this means he is vain or in love with himself. And while it is technically true that he was in love with himself, he believed he was in love with another person. Every time he attempted to touch this ideal person that he saw in the water, it would vanish. Our culture gets hung up on the fact that he was in love with his own image, but that's not the point. The point is that he wasted his life in pursuit of an illusion, a fantasy of perfection that ultimately led to depression, despair, and emptiness. While many of us have heard the beginning of this myth, most haven't heard the end, where he dies from starvation on the bank of the river. Morrison writes, "The mirror image fragmented each time Narcissus reached out to embrace it, causing him to pine away in melancholy and ultimately to die." The original narcissist was more vulnerable than arrogant, more depleted and desperate than full of himself. The story of Narcissus, like the disorder that bears his name, is a tragedy. As it turns out, Disney's Beauty and the Beast had two narcissistic characters. Gaston is the one everyone thinks of. He's the grandiose narcissist. He lines up almost perfectly with the DSM definition and the popular image of narcissism. But what you didn't realize is that the Beast is also a narcissist. He has a damaged self-image. He obsessively ruminates about his appearance. He constantly compares himself to an idealized image of himself as a younger prince, and then jealously guards the withering rose he sees as his last connection to that image of perfection. He's hypersensitive to criticism, easily angered, and he hides his true feelings for fear of being rejected. Originally, he only allows Belle to stay in the castle because he thinks it will reverse the spell and make him beautiful again. He's using her to salvage his self-esteem. Arguably, compared to Gaston, the Beast is the more mentally ill, and by that I mean he's more symptomatic. Gaston is very well defended by his grandiosity, but like the castle in which he lives, the Beast is falling apart. And that's what we mean by vulnerable narcissism. So what does vulnerable narcissism actually look like? Well, it's not as easy to hate. Vulnerable narcissism is correlated with depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and even suicide. As I mentioned before, contemporary research looks at the interplay between grandiosity and vulnerability. These terms simply describe how a person is attempting to manage their unstable self-esteem. It's important to underscore that these are not mutually exclusive types of narcissist. Rather than a cold faucet and a hot faucet, think of a combined faucet, where grandiosity and vulnerability mix together depending on the situation. A 2010 article in the Annual Review of Clinical Psychology, a peer-reviewed journal, said it best. The core feature of pathological narcissism is not grandiosity, but rather defective self-esteem regulation, leading to grandiose and vulnerable self and affect states. So individuals with pathological narcissism fluctuate between grandiosity and vulnerability. Some may spend more time in a grandiose state, while others may spend more time in a vulnerable state. It depends on how well defended the individual is. Grandiosity is a defensive distortion that occurs in response to deeply held feelings of inferiority, envy, anger, and shame. When the grandiose defenses break down, the underlying vulnerable self-image is exposed. For some narcissists, this rarely, if ever, happens, while others live their lives in a near constant state of breakdown. Most float somewhere in between. That being said, if a patient in a vulnerable narcissistic state did walk into a therapist consulting room, how would they diagnose them? Well, it's currently not possible to diagnose a patient whose narcissistic presentation is predominantly vulnerable. Such a patient could plausibly receive any combination of the following diagnoses. All of them could be technically accurate, but still miss the essential problem. So what are the common core features of narcissism? What should a clinician look for to diagnose a narcissist? Well, here's a list of common features. A few of these overlap with the DSM-5 criteria, but most of them don't. Instead, they're taken from clinical and research literature. First, there's interpersonal exploitativeness, and that's the tendency to use others, whether intentionally or unintentionally, in the service of self-esteem maintenance. There's self-sacrificing self-enhancement, and that's the tendency to perform charitable deeds or give people compliments or do good things for others in the hopes that it will reflect positively on the narcissistic individual. Grandiose fantasy. That's the belief that one is better than others or more deserving. The important points here are that this belief can be conscious or unconscious, and that it is fundamentally compensatory, meaning that it's used to prop up underlying unstable self-esteem. There's contingent self-esteem. That's the tendency to base self-image and self-esteem on the reactions of others. And this is why narcissists can appear overly sensitive and easily wounded, hiding the self. That's the tendency to hide authentic thoughts, needs, and feelings from other people, for fear that they will lead to traumatic rejection and abandonment. Devaluing. That's when an individual feels like they're better than others, or they cast other people aside when those people no longer serve a self-esteem maintenance function. And by the way, a narcissist can also devalue themselves, which leads to depressive episodes and even suicide. Entitlement rage. Narcissists tend to react to any perceived threat with defensive rage. Sometimes the rage is turned outwards toward others. But sometimes the rage is directed inward, and they attack and devalue themselves for not being good enough. Emptiness. This is based on something called identity diffusion, which is common in people with personality disorders. There's a feeling of inner emptiness because they lack a stable, integrated sense of self, chronically fragmenting self. Narcissists base their self-image on unrealistic ideas of being perfect. It's thought that they do this because of early relational trauma that occurred at a time when they were attempting to create a realistic self-image. Because of this trauma, they're stuck with a self-image that is unrealistic and that falls apart easily, which we call fragmentation. When this happens, the narcissist tumbles into a terrifying world filled with something a famous psychoanalyst named Donald Winnicott called primitive agonies. These are experiences of unthinkable anxiety that occasionally lead to substance abuse or violence or even suicide. Perfectionism and idealization. This is the tendency to feel that one either is or must be perfect, and the tendency to idealize other people as extensions of the idealized perfect self. It's thought that this occurs when children are not shown through warmth and acceptance that they will still be loved even if they aren't perfect. And finally, shame, often called the underbelly of narcissism. Shame is the feeling that one's entire self is bad, unwanted, or unworthy. It's a toxic experience that leads people to become at odds with themselves. Shame breeds both grandiosity as a defense and depression when the idealized self that is created to combat shame fails to live up to its promise. I hope that by now it's clear that narcissism is much more than a preening peacock or an evil stepmother, although to be fair, it can be both of those things. But more often, it's the quietly depressed or anxious person who feels they can never live up to their own unrealistic standards. It's the guy who seems to have everything but suddenly shoots himself because he was carrying around a broken self-image and he felt he never lived up to who he was supposed to be. It's the child who was emotionally neglected by self-absorbed parents and grew up relying on fantasies of self-sufficiency. When that child tries to make it as an adult in the world, they feel chronically invisible, empty, depressed, and angry. Narcissism is a fortress built around deep emotional wounds. Whether the fortress is functioning well or falling apart, all who struggle with narcissism carry deep emotional pain in their core. The author Stephen Johnson calls narcissists used children. These are people whose most basic needs for consistent love and mirroring were denied or distorted when they were young. The vast majority of people who we would call narcissistic are not manipulative villains looking for the next victim. They're like people drowning in the sea who will blindly step on another person's head out of the sheer panic of feeling like they're about to go under. They're like starving people who are so hungry for something to sustain their fragile self-image that they can think of little else. Their self-centeredness is about survival, not an abundance of self-love. Nevertheless, narcissism remains one of the few mental health issues that is still openly mocked, derided, and equated with evil. In the last 10 years, a number of studies have been looking at these issues, eventually producing a measure that actually seems to be a huge improvement over the NPI. It's called the Pathological Narcissism Inventory, and it's a full-spectrum measure that assesses both grandiose and vulnerable dimensions of narcissism. It's also correlated with other measures of emotional distress, variable self-esteem, and hallmarks of significant personality pathology. In other words, we're finally approaching a definition of narcissism as a mental illness, as opposed to a moral or character defect. The current DSM model of NPD arguably does more harm than good. It contributes to diagnostic and research confusion, while indirectly supporting a growing industry based on vilification and stigmatization of a vulnerable population. While some individuals with NPD may present in accordance with the DSM criteria, research suggests that this is rare, and that many narcissistic individuals seek treatment experiencing intense feelings of worthlessness, depression, anxiety, interpersonal problems, inconsistent self-image, shame, substance abuse, and suicidality. Such individuals are not served by a skewed and inaccurate diagnostic model, nor are they helped by public fear and antagonism. It's time to rethink the dominant diagnostic paradigm pertaining to narcissism, in hopes that such revisions will have a positive effect on the widespread stigma relating to this form of mental illness. Thanks for joining me. I've included the references for this video in the description. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. If you'd like to learn more about narcissism and related topics, you can visit my website at www.drettensohn.com. Take care.